When they both came outside and opened Mr. David's car, the school uniform was gone. They found out it was missing. The school uniform was nowhere to be found. "Why is the uniform?" Tina asked in awe as she stared inside the empty car. "It was right there. I left it there. I saw it before coming to call you," Tina said to Mr. David. "I'm not sure you know what you're talking about," Mr. David screamed, almost driven to madness by disbelief. "Honey, I am certain I left the school uniform right here at the back of the car. I saw it before locking the car and entering the hospital to see you. How could it have disappeared? No one else has my car key. Who could have placed and removed the school uniform?" Mr. David fell to the ground, gasping for air. Tina was shocked, lost in thoughts, and stood motionless without saying a word. Mr. David could not endure it anymore. He fell to the ground and fainted. Tina screamed and called out for help. The patient care assistants arrived and took Mr. David into the hospital, where he was placed on treatment. Immediately after some hours, Mr. David woke up and found himself lying on the hospital bed with Tina sitting very close to him. Tina said to Mr. David, when they entered the doctor's office, they asked him if Naomi was okay. The doctor told them that they were free to go back with Naomi. He only told them what to avoid if they wanted her to get better quickly. "Don't allow your daughter to be around things that will make her unhappy. She needs to be happy always to help her heal faster," the doctor said to Mr. David and Tina. Mr. David wanted to tell the doctor that Naomi wasn't there, but it felt as if something asked him not to. Mr. David thanked the doctor and paid all the necessary bills which were in the receipt. He also made sure he bought the necessary drugs from the pharmacy. Then he left the hospital with his wife and Naomi. That night, after dinner, Mr. David, Tina, they took Naomi into Pascal's room. It was still intact after 2 years since Pascal passed away. None of Pascal's belongings were thrown away or given out. It was as if he never left. Tina always took her time to arrange the room and keep it clean. Whenever she felt the need to be with a child, she goes in there. "Honey," Tina called her husband as they both lay in bed. "Yes, dear? Will you still go looking for her parents tomorrow?" Mr. David took a while and then he heaved a sigh. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "I'm so confused. It seems like something is keeping me from finding the little girl's parents, and I just cannot explain it," he said, staring at the ceiling. "I know it will sound selfish, but why don't we keep her? For her to have encountered an accident means her parents are not rich enough. We may give her back and they won't be able to take care of her health issues. Let's keep her till she fully recovers and regains her memory. Do you think giving her up after getting attached is going to be easy?" Mr. David asked, moving his gaze to his wife. "I don't know," Tina answered. It was a long night for the couple. Mr. David kept trying to figure out what had made the school uniform disappear, till the sweet arms of sleep took them. The next day, Mr. David woke up very early and went to check on Naomi. She was sleeping peacefully. He got ready for work and left the house. Tina stayed at home because she wanted to keep an eye on Naomi for a while. Naomi was having her breakfast when Deborah walked in after Tina opened the door for her. She had called Tina to ask about Naomi, and Tina told her she would be at home the next day. Naomi greeted Deborah in a sweet voice which was almost inaudible, and Deborah responded. Deborah dragged Tina by her hand out of where Naomi was seated. She asked her softly what was her next plan with Naomi since she was already better. Tina told Deborah that they planned on keeping Naomi till she recovers fully. "I knew it. I saw the way you were feeding that little girl at the..."
God, why did you bring goo into my life? Why are you torturing me? Do I really deserve all these pains? The more she tried to hold in the tears, the more they streamed down her cheeks.
Mr. Bright, Naomi's father, was still trying to reach out to his mother who had hung up the call earlier. "Hello, Mama. Are you still there?"
My son, I don't think this is what we can talk about over the phone. Can you come back to the village tomorrow with your wife? I think there is something I really need to show you.
Mama, you're really making me and my wife anxious. Tell me what you know about her dream and the faceless man, please.
It's a long story, my son. Please come back to the village as soon as possible.
Mr. Bright slowly brought the phone down, his mind racing with questions and concerns. Mr. Bright and his wife began preparing for their impromptu travel to the village. When they were done, they left their house very early. Mr. Bright's village was just a few hours away, but the journey felt like an eternity, filled with anticipation and unease.
My son, Many years ago, I was heavily pregnant with you when my late husband, your father, was into a land dispute with 3 men. They all claimed ownership of your father's land. Your father called his uncles to help him, but they all turned their backs on him. I pleaded with your father to let the lands go, but he told me he wouldn't let his father's sweat be in vain. When all hopes were beginning to fade away, your father took me to the land at night. In front of the biggest tree inside the land, your father made a promise to the tree. He told the tree that if he takes over the land as the rightful owner, he was going to dedicate all his future generations to it, starting from the one I had in my womb. Then your father cut himself with a sharp object and smeared the blood on the trunk of the tree. Those who had come to drag the land with your father came begging him. They said a faceless being was chasing them all around, even in their dreams. One of them died because he tried to stay and continue fighting. Your father took over all the land for himself. When you were born, your father dedicated you to the tree. It's been so many years. Your father died, and I had already forgotten about it. When you called me and told me about the faceless man in your wife's dream, it took me down memory lane. My son, I think that it was the faceless man that caused the accident which Naomi got involved in. I think it wants to take the child away from you and your wife for not dedicating her to him. S2. Media. Family having a serious conversation on a bench outside. Outside, Mama, please. My wife and I are curious. Tell us about the faceless man and what he wants with our little princess.
It all began to make sense to Mr. Bright. He couldn't explain how he had suddenly forgotten to take his daughter back from school. He always went there earlier than the normal time. Neither could Sandra explain why there was a sudden traffic that got her phone stolen. None of them remembered to call the school to tell them they would be coming later than usual. Naomi was a very smart girl, and her leaving the school without waiting for them also made sense. Of all the hospitals in the city, his daughter was transferred to another city which they knew not about. Even Mr. Bright began to understand why the man who had knocked his daughter would come to meet them in the hospital and go.
How can a tree torment my life? Where was the tree when my wife and I were looking for a child after waiting on God for a child? Mama, you're telling me a tree is in charge of my daughter's disappearance? You and Papa dedicated me to a tree?
Mr. Bright said, fuming with anger. He stood up from the bench, entered into the house, and came out with a machete.
I'm going to bring that tree down today. I want it to show me its powers.
He said and walked out with the machete. Mama begged her son not to cause any harm to the tree. She told him to appease it for it to bring their daughter back, but Mr. Bright had already made up his mind. He arrived where the tree was and yelled at the tree, then started cutting it. By the time Sandra and Mama would get to where Mr. Bright was, he had already started digging his machete into the tree. After a few minutes of cutting into the tree, Mr. Bright's hand began to shake. He adjusted his hand and continued cutting. Then his hand started shaking vigorously. The machete fell off from his hand. Mr. Bright was just staring at his hands, and sweat, which gathered all over his face, started dropping on the ground. His legs began to tremble, and he started breathing heavily. He turned to look at his wife and his mother, who were staring at him, and then he fell. Do you think Mr. Bright will survive the attack from the tree? And even if he survives, do you think he will be able to defeat the faceless spirits? We will find out in the next episode, which is the final episode. Stay tuned. If you enjoyed this story, please share with your loved ones, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the exciting conclusion in the next episode. See you guys in the final episode. Thank you and God bless.
Hospital, but let me tell you, Tina, you are my friend, and I can't give you bad advice. Return this little girl to her parents. You are a mother, and you know what you went through when you lost Pascal.
Don't talk about Pascal, Tina said immediately, cutting off Deborah's words.
How do you intend we find her parents? She can't even remember herself. She needs intensive care, and I'm going to give it to her. This has nothing to do with Pascal.
This has nothing to do with Pascal,
Tina said, and a tear rolled down her cheek.
Mommy, Mommy!
Naomi's sweet voice called out to Sandra. Sandra quickly turned, and there was Naomi in her school uniform smiling at her. She was holding her lunchbox, and her smile was so cute as she shook her head slowly from left to right, showing a bit of her teeth. Sandra spread her arms wide for Naomi to run into them with so much joy. Naomi sprinted forward towards Sandra. Suddenly, an invisible force stopped Naomi from reaching out to Sandra. Sandra couldn't explain what was happening. She then tried running towards Naomi, but she couldn't. The invisible force then took the form of a man. It held Naomi and dragged her backwards while Naomi kept crying for her mother.
Give me my child. Give me Naomi back, please. She's all I have.
Sandra kept shouting and crying out bitterly.
She's never coming back to you.
The man without a face said in a cold voice. Naomi suddenly stopped crying. The man smiled at her and she smiled back. The man held Naomi by her hand and walked away with her. Sandra couldn't understand what was going on. She tried running after them, but she slipped and fell down.
Naomi!
She shouted as tears ran down her cheeks.
Sandy.
Mr. Bright kept calling and tapping Sandra. Sandra woke up and it was just a dream, but it felt so real to her.
He said he wouldn't give her back to me. He took her. They took my daughter. They took Naomi. Please bring her back.
Sandra cried out, sobbing bitterly.
Who took our daughter? Did you see any face?
No, I didn't see any face. He had no face. He said my daughter is no longer mine. He took my daughter. He took Naomi.
Sandra said and continued sobbing. Mr. Bright kept consoling his wife.
Bitterly, who took our daughter? Did you see any face? He asked, still holding her.
No, I didn't see any face. He had no face. He said my daughter is no longer mine. He took my daughter. He took Naomi, Sandra said and continued sobbing.
Mr. Bright kept consoling his wife, who wouldn't stop crying. She stood up and tried leaving the room, but Mr. Bright wouldn't let her. He didn't trust her judgment anymore. She was slowly losing it. He dragged her slowly back to the bed. Mr. Bright didn't know who to call at such a time. He decided to call his mother, since Sandra's mother was no more. Mr. Bright's mother picked up the call. She tried consoling Sandra over the phone. Ever since Naomi got missing, she had always called them to know if there was an update. Mr. Bright told his mother about Sandra's dream. He told her about the faceless man Sandra saw in her dream that took Naomi.
Did you say a faceless man? His mother asked over the phone. Yes, she said the man was faceless. Hello? Hello, Mama, Mr. Bright kept saying over the phone without getting a response. It turned out his mother switched the call on, hearing about the faceless man.
Back at Mr. David's office, Mr. David was seated in his office, but his mind was not at rest. He kept thinking about what he had discussed with his wife. He began to pace around inside his office. Mr. David really wanted to find Naomi's parents, but he couldn't tell what was really stopping him. He didn't want to get attached to Naomi because giving her up would be more difficult. Keeping her too wouldn't be a good decision because he could already feel the love his wife had for Naomi. Things got confusing for Mr. David. His mind went back to the uniform that got missing and appeared back inside his car. He had arrived at the hospital but didn't enter because of the distress call from his wife. Nothing was really wrong with Naomi, and he drove all the way back, denying his wife the right to console herself from the death of their only child, which she hadn't grown over, or taking back the child to the parents who were going through a lot because of their missing child. The decision was getting tougher and tougher for Mr. David. The doctor had also said Naomi stood a chance of losing her memory forever.
What if she loses her memory forever? Mr. David asked himself and heaved a sigh.
Back at Tina's home, Tina and her friend Deborah were still having a heated conversation on whether to keep Naomi or return her to her parents.
I'm so sorry, Tina. I know what you're thinking. You call me a bad friend for talking to you about all this. I just feel the little girl's parents need to know that their daughter is okay. I really can't help it. If my daughter was knocked down, the pains of losing a child is...
Please stop it, Deborah. Please, can you leave my house? I plead with you. Don't open old wounds. Just go, Tina pleaded, trying to hold in the building tears.
It's okay, I will go, Deborah said, and picked up her handbag. I'm sorry.
Just leave, please, Tina said, holding her hands together and cutting Deborah's words.
As soon as Deborah left the house, Tina ran into Pascal's room. She shut the door behind her and then lay on his bed. Sweet memories that she had shared with her son came playing inside her mind. Tina lay on Pascal's bed, holding his bedspread and crying her eyes out. She only wished her son was still alive.
Why didn't you take me too?